Welcome to Governance Bites. I'm Mark Banicevich, and today I'm absolutely honoured to spend more time with Tracey Berry.
Hi
Tracey.
Hey.
Tracey's a really experienced executive manager who has also got a lot of board experience. So she's got a background on both sides of this executive board equation. And her executive roles have been largely in banking through Kiwibank. And
Westpac. And BNZ.
Right.
And TSB.
So
not all of them.
No, but a lot of them the largest New Zealand banks and
Somewhat,
the higher end of the second level of banks as well, banks like TSB. And also has been on the board of the National Provident Fund, been the chair of Nikko Asset Management, New Zealand arm for a while, has been on the Financial Advice Disciplinary Committee, which is a body of people who does kind of the judgments and investigations on financial advisors who are misbehaving for over a decade. So a real breadth of experience in this kind of space. So I look forward to this conversation.
Yeah,
Thank you, Tracey.
great. Excited to be here.
Now, the last conversation we had was around the culture in the board, and this time we're going to have a conversation around the culture between the board and the executive. And as I said before, you've been on both sides of that equation, so it'd be really interesting to get your thoughts on this. What I'd like to ask initially, what are some of the indicators of a healthy and effective culture between board and management?
I think, so from my perspective, I distinctly remember the first time I was ever invited into the boardroom. I was a relatively sort of middle management member of staff, so I wasn't someone who would ordinarily go into a board meeting or my role, and I'd been asked to do a piece of analysis, and the CEO wanted me to come in and talk to my analysis, which sort of was around something that he was presenting, and the board, I didn't know the board, I didn't know any members of the board, and I remember a board member yelling, like actually yelling not at me, but about the sort of the piece of work that was being presented, and the analysis was a component of that. And I just remember being so distraught. It wasn't targeted at me, but that environment, being in that environment, and I walked away from that sort of, I'm never going to be
traumatised.
It was traumatising. I thought he was really mean and aggressive, and I remember afterwards people just go, oh no, he's like that at every meeting. When he's not happy about something, that's how he expresses himself. But as I think we have to remember the shadow we cast in those environments, and so the totality of my board experience and my perception of a board was the sum total of that 5 or 10 minutes in that room.
Right.
And for him, he may have gone on to have 100 more minutes of wonderful interactions in that board meeting, but my entire perception of boards was framed by that moment. And so I always sort of cast myself back to that, whether I'm on a board or in a board, going, what is the experience that I want management to have, or if I am management, what is the experience I want to have? Now, that experience was 20 plus years ago, and one hopes that the conduct and culture of the financial sector has moved on significantly in the last 20 years. But nonetheless, I think we've all been in those environments where actually sometimes board members do throw toys, or management do throw toys, and it's just not conducive, particularly if you've got sort of more junior or emerging staff. So for me, what good looks like between management and board is they can have conversations where they are debating or disagreeing and so forth, but they're done in such a way that it's really constructive, it's clear communication, and it's built on a foundation of mutual trust and respect. So they're not, it's not personal, there's no attacks and things like that. And I think, for me, some of the things where, I've either experienced or seen where it's not been as conducive to that is where there's a difference of understanding between roles and responsibilities, the role of the governor versus the role of management, and one or both are overreaching. Or blurring the lines, and we can talk a little bit about sort of the archetypes for some of those board compositions.
Please.
So, you've got the overly collaborative board, so the board that is so collaborative with management, you're not sure where board starts and stops and management starts and stop, and they are so aligned and so collaborative that it can jeopardise the role of the board actually to provide independence and oversight and to challenge. It's very agreeable people, and so a lot of sort of groupthink sometimes. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got the overly cynical and sceptic board, who don't trust management and feel it's their role to control them, and in that regard, you've got often have board members making decisions on behalf of management, and which is incredibly disengaging, and there's a high level of mistrust usually between the two. It's obvious by the board when you're in there, and clearly you can get the sense when the executive team leave the room exactly how they might feel about that board meeting that just happened. So both of those are sort of either end of the spectrum. And then you have the sort of the ones in the middle. I like to, we'll call it the advisory board, all care, no responsibility. So, really good, usually very talented and skilled board members, but perhaps what they're doing is providing advice to management actually rather than providing direction and decisions, and they're leaving it largely to management, sort of going, well, it's management's job. And I think it's imperative to remember that board members aren't bystanders or advisors. They've got skin in the game.
A lot.
A lot of skin in the game, and I think I think recently we're being reminded of some of that, which is useful to remind people of the responsibilities fiduciary that they're taking on when they take on these positions.
Yes, certainly. Okay, thank you. It's interesting that you talk about your early experience and something so traumatising, and you can either go one of two ways from that, right? You can never go into a boardroom ever again, or you can say, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do this better than I experienced it my first time. It reminds me of I've had the same attitude towards public speaking, where my first experience public speaking was an absolute disaster. I had no coaching. I was 12. I was talking from my school, and I was teased about it for the rest of my high school career. And I just decided I'm going to become a good public speaker, and I still have a long way to go, but it's you either get back on the horse or you never get back on a horse again. So it's great to...
Well, I was in that particular instance, I was lucky that the CEO was incredibly supportive, and he was outraged, and and so that gave me a lot of confidence that it probably was the director in this particular instance, not me, but at the same time I ended up having to have several more interactions, and they went much more favourably, but it really does sort of ingrain in you kind of those experiences of what not to do. Sometimes you learn more from being engaged in an environment that is not healthy, that you go, right, now I know what good looks like.
Yes. Yeah. So on that point then, you've already given us some of these some thoughts in this space, but what are some of the symptoms that you'd see of an unhealthy culture between board and management?
Yeah, so you might see a management team who's kind of the good news management team. So papers are peppered full of improvements and what we've done well and what's going well, and there's an absence of kind of risks and bad news, because the perception is the board don't want to hear bad news, or perhaps when they get bad news they don't respond to it like they should, or or maybe management's just deliberately withholding information. And so those are the sort of some of the tangible ways that some of this sort of shows up. And then of course when bad news does finally reach a board, as it invariably does, because something will go wrong, of course that only deepens the cycle of mistrust, because they're like, well, why didn't you tell us this? I mean, the expectations from most boards are for no surprises, but at the same time boards can't react vehemently against that, and every time something is raised, that the whole purpose of management is to bring it to their attention, so they can't respond negatively, otherwise they will breed that culture. So that's some of the ways, and similarly the culture within a board can play out between a board and management as well. So if there's because boards aren't necessarily always a group of people that have come aligned to the same objectives. The board may be comprised of different shareholder groups with different objectives.
Yes.
And so, sometimes the dynamics of the board are a lot to manage within the board, let alone with management who might be trying to manage, different shareholder expectations that are represented by different board members and so forth. And so, how that sort of all folds together. But you need to have a really strong relationship between the CEO and the chair and the board. And I think, if boards can do anything well, it's hire the right CEO and set the right tone, because everything just sort of filters down through that.
Right, absolutely. Okay, so how does board and management culture interact with its strategy? So, companies got a strategy. Does the board culture differ depending on what the strategy of the company is?
Yeah, it should. So, company's strategy is, typically augmented or created by virtue of the board, and so, the board culture needs to align back to that strategy. So, if you've got a strategy and you're in a sector that maybe is very innovative and very growth focused, then it may require a culture that is higher in its risk-taking appetite. Risk budgets will reflect that. There might be more autonomy provided, and so you've got this alignment between the culture that's showing up and the decisions that are being made and the organisational objectives that are being sought. Conversely, if you're in a highly regulated environment, then you may have a culture that is more focused on risks.
Yes, more conservative.
That's right. And so the culture of the board. So if you've got board members who are at sort of either ends of the risk spectrum, that can be more difficult for management to understand where the parameters for their decisioning and the risk appetite is, for example. Yeah.
Right, okay.
And that's born out of strategy.
Okay, yeah. Right. Just coming back to the issue of a poor dynamic between the board and executive, how would someone go around fixing that or trying to remedy that, and who would be responsible for trying to sort that out?
Well, I mean, ultimately it's sort of all parties, but it tends to lend back to the chair, unless the chair is the problem, let's hope not, but it is incumbent on the chair and the board to be able to work harmoniously with management, and if there are genuine issues that need to be resolved, then they should be done in a collaborative way, and if they're performance-based, they should be dealt with in the appropriate way, but certainly not in a forum of other people. And so, there needs to be the structure and the defined roles and responsibilities, but also, I guess, the willingness on both sides to resolve the issues in a way that generally requires both sets to take actions. It's seldom just one. Dysfunction tends to come as a result of both.
So if you're a chair of a board like that, would you start with one-on-one conversations with other members of the board, with the CEO, and then work together from there?
Yeah, and you may introduce an independent if you felt that it was harder to elicit genuine feedback from some members of the board or management. So if people have lost confidence or lost trust, then it can be hard to have an environment where it feels right for them to, bring everything to the table, and so sometimes a third party can help that process.
Right, okay. Well, I guess one final question for you then, off the topic of board culture. You've been a director now for a number of years. What advice would you give to someone who's starting their journey?
I think if I was starting out again, I think that knowing how I want it to end when I start, I think would be a useful guiding light. So what I mean by that is, what legacy do you want to leave? How do you want to be perceived as a director? What on balance contribution do you want to make? And what is the shadow that you want to cast? Because I think you can kind of use that as your guiding light to go, well, am I measuring up to my own and everybody else's standards that are required of me? Right. And then, invariably when things happen and you maybe get a little bit off track, or maybe the meeting didn't go as well as it could have or should have, you can reflect on that and immediately take corrective action. Yeah, and so kind of knowing that, we'll call it the director strategy, knowing my director strategy means I can stay on path. Perhaps maybe there's certain types of industries or certain types of roles that appeal more to you than maybe certain other types of industries or roles where you go, I don't think that aligns with my value set, for example. And so there's those sorts of, what direction as a director do I want to take? And then there's, how do I want to show up? What's my cultural footprint inside that boardroom and to, all of the colleagues that I'll interact with from management.
Right, so you could sit down and start by setting your goals earlier. Where do I want to be as a director in 20, 30 years' time? And then work backwards from there and say, what's my path going to be like to get there? And then in each role, also setting your goals and saying, what imprint do I want to leave on this business? Which wouldn't necessarily, or shouldn't be an agenda to say, this is what this company is going to achieve with me in it, but more along the lines of how you're going to interact with the rest the board and what value you're going to add and what skills and experience you bring and how you're going to share that with that board.
Well, we kind of make choices how we show up, so one of the things that I'm really particular around is that I read the papers, and that I make comprehensive notes, and then I engage in conversation, and if I don't know, I'll ask. And they're all very deliberate things to do, and very experienced directors, I'm sure it just sort of flies off the cuff, but for new directors, you have to go, I want to make sure that I show up, that I express my points, and that that I'm given the opportunity to engage in those conversations, and I've got the confidence to ask the stupid questions. I think curiosity and an inquisitive mindset, you can't be underplayed in the boardroom. Sometimes it's that next best question that actually gets the best outcome.
Yes, and when you're stepping into a business that you don't know, you also don't come with the baggage, the predefined understanding of how this company works, and sometimes those stupid questions can actually lead to quite valuable insights, can't they? People think, I haven't really thought about it. Why do we do it that way? Maybe we don't need to do it that way. So
it's just always been done that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Tracey, again, thank you very much for your time. Great conversation.
Yeah,
nice to see you in person, given that you live in the capital, and it's nice to have you up in the Big Smoke.
Yeah, great, thanks.
I'll look forward to catching up with you again soon.
Perfect.
And see you next episode.
See you.